For the first part of this tutorial, we're going to look at acquiring the Epic Games Launcher to download the actual Unreal Engine. We'll be covering the various areas of the launcher, how they work, and how we can use them to develop your own Unreal Engine games. So let's begin by going to unrealengine.com in your web browser. Once you're here, I want you to go to this Get Unreal button in the top right hand corner. Click it, and then register for an Epic Games account. Now if you've already registered for one, you can just click the sign in button here. Either way, you'll end up in the same place. From here, all you need to do is select the platform that you want to develop on, Windows or Mac. In my situation, it's going to be Windows, so I'm going to click this button. Once you've downloaded the launcher and followed the prompts to install it, you just need to log in with your Epic Games account. So enter your details again. Immediately I'm greeted by this community tab, but this isn't where I want to be. Don't worry, we'll come back to this in just a minute. First off, I want to go to the library section. And from the library section, I'm going to click Add Versions. You should see the latest version of Unreal Engine now appearing here. I'm going to click Install, and it's going to give me a new prompt. So this new prompt lets me select all of the installation options for this version of Unreal. Do I want starter content? Do I want templates and feature packs? Unreal Engine's actual source code, art tools? As well as this, it also includes things for us to download that allow us to deploy to various new platforms, such as iOS, Android, HTML5, or Linux. Now, I'm going to keep the defaults checked here, just in case. I'm also going to enable the art tools, because these are really good to have. For the most part, art tools refers to the tools that you would use within 3ds Max or Maya to work with Unreal. So with those checked, I'm now going to go Install. And you'll see that the download kicks off, and in the top right hand corner here, we can see the download and its progress as we go on. So I'm going to go back to this community tab, and I'm going to show you the Epic Games Launcher. Now, a lot of people would cast this aside thinking it's just a news tab, but realistically it actually includes links to your answer hub, forums, wiki, roadmap, and blog, and these are very, very useful for developers. So let's take a look at these. The Answer Hub is an area for you to just find solutions to issues that you may be facing. This is where you can report bugs or issues that you're having and see if anyone has a good idea on how to actually solve them. The forums are for discussion with the community, so these can be very, very useful. You might want to scout out a team here. You might want to float an idea of something that you're looking to develop, see what people think. As well as that, you can talk about general features and the way the engine's going. Plus, if we scroll down to the bottom here, you can see that we actually have forums for various different areas of the world that you can go through. This is very, very useful if you're trying to form something local. So the Epic Wiki is a very, very useful area for you to get actual in-depth information on specific features. All you have to do is go to it, do a search for the feature that you want, and you'll find a wealth of information at your fingertips. This is really, really useful if you want to try and get as much of an idea about a feature as you can. Next up, we have the roadmap. Now the roadmap is very useful. A lot of people don't know that this actually exists, but it's very, very useful because it lists all of the things that Epic are currently working on, or at least considering working on. This means that you're not kind of in the dark about features that'll be in the engine in 6 months' time. You can actually vote on the things that you would really like to see. So if I scroll through here, one of the things that I can see is a lot of features actually coming up in the next version. I can see that this 4.15 feature is done, and that'll be useful for me. One of the great things about this is that I don't have to spend my time developing features for the game that are going to be coming into the engine in no time anyway, and developed by someone else. This allows me to save time and resources and work smarter. Next up we have the blog. The blog's great because it's not only the newsfeed, but it also has highlights for community development as well as developer features that they really want to discuss with the public. This can be a great way to find out all sorts of information that you wouldn't actually know about certain features or certain things that the community have done. Now if I go past the community tab and look at the Learn tab, this is really where what I believe the most useful area is. Not only do I have documentation and video tutorials, but if I scroll down, I have entire engine feature samples that are Epic's way of demonstrating how to implement things. These are entire projects that I can download and I can see how they were made. I can go through, I can look at every effect, I can look at every line of code and every shader, and I can see how everything is put together, and I can use this to try and understand how best to create my own projects. Not everyone's a programmer and not everyone's a 3D artist, so the marketplace is fantastic because it lets you go in and just cheaply purchase new features for your game. art or programming, or even audio. So go through here and see what's there. And don't worry, if you're worried about the cost of some of these things, there are plenty of free assets that are available to you as well. So if I load up this, for instance, I can see that there are Infinity Blade assets provided by Epic that are entire environments and character sets, as well as weapon sets, that are all mobile ready and available for you to implement in your own projects for free. We're going to cover this a bit more later. Next up, we have the Library tab. This gives you an overview of every single project that you're currently working on or have installed on your computer, and as well as that, we actually have a listing of every version of the engine you currently see. If this exclamation mark appears, it means that the version that you have here is out of date and that there's an update available for it. The final thing that we're going to look at is Unreal Tournament. I can't stress enough how useful this is. Unreal Tournament is a collaboration between Epic Games and the community to develop a new Unreal Tournament game. So the reason this is really useful is that you can actually load a full game that's in active development and see every feature, every line of code, every art asset, and you can see how they've been implemented, which means when you go to do this for yourself, life is way, way easier because you can pull everything apart and get a better understanding of everything that's there. Be aware that it's quite a large download and that if you want to get it, you want to get the one from the Create tab and not the Play tab, because the Create tab is the one that gives you the editor access, whereas Play is a cooked down version of the game. So that's it for the time being. Once this download is finished and you've got the latest version of the engine, I want you to go on to the next tutorial. Thanks. Hello everyone. So this time around, we're going to actually be working with Unreal Engine. We're not just going to be looking at the launcher. And I'm going to have to make sure that you've downloaded your assets for this section. I've pre-created a project that's already got some things in it for us. It's called ArcViz Demo. And I'm going to need you to open that up and double click on the U project file. Okay, and upon doing so, you'll be greeted with this. Now, once you've opened it for the first time, it will now appear inside of your launcher and you can open it any stage after that. But for the very first time you load it, you're going to need to either launch the engine and then select it, or straight up double click on the U project file. Now, once you're in, you'll be greeted with this. And this is your first introduction to Unreal Engine. So to begin with, we're going to cover some of the basics. To move around the viewport, I can use my mouse and I can hold right click and move my mouse. And while doing this, this allows me to look around the viewport. While holding right click, I'm actually also able to use W, A, S, and D, so standard first person controls, to move around like this as well. You can use Q and you can use E while holding right click to also jump up and down. Now, if you don't want to use your keyboard as well, you can use your left click to move around the viewport like this. You'll notice that as I rotate left, it moves left, and as I rotate right, it moves right. And if I hold both at the same time, I'm able to move directly up and directly down, or directly left and directly right. So that's how you can have up, down, strafe left, and strafe right going on. Now, within this viewport, we've got a couple of things, but there's really not much there. But that's okay. So to begin with, what we've got is this little icon in the middle. If I click on this, I can see that up top here, this comes to life and selects the icon. And that's because this section in the top right is the world outliner. So anything that is currently in my environment is automatically selected within the world outliner. If I was to click on the light source, I would see that this has now been selected as well. If I click down here, I would be able to select my atmospheric fog. Now, whenever I click on something, you'll see that a couple of other things pop up. First off is this widget. We've got up, right, and forward. And these represent the three axes of movement. We have x-axes, y-axes, and z-axes. So red refers to x-axes, green refers to as y-axes, and blue is the z-axes. Now, when I select any of these things, I'm able to move the object along that axis. If I click there, I can now move it. And of course, if I click here, I'm able to shift it as well. So, some very basic stuff, but if I was to select this button up here, or alternatively hit the space bar, it'll cycle widgets, and I now get a rotation widget. And again, if I was to grab this, I'm able to rotate it. Now, some people might be confused as to why the colors seem different. Before, blue, or Z, was pointing upwards, but it's not anymore. The reason for that is this represents rotation, and rotation is actually spinning around the axes. So the best way to visualize that is if I go back to this, you can see that the blue axis points up, and therefore, when I rotate, I'm spinning around that up arrow. And this is how I can use this to spin in various different ways, and we can put the object in any position that we want to. Now, the final one that we get is scale, and if I click this, I'm able to scale. And this just makes it bigger or smaller, and increases. Now, I'm sure you've noticed as I've been doing this, that my numbers in the right-hand side over here are reflecting the changes that I'm making. If I was to move this up, I can see that my location has changed to 272 on the Z-axis. If I move it down, 122. Now, at any stage, if you move something up and you want it to fall to the ground, you can press the End key, and it will automatically drop to the ground. So the reason I brought these up is because this is the Details panel. The Details panel represents your basic attributes for any item. If I was to click on this light, I can now see that I have the ability to affect just how bright it is in the world. If I was to click on the player start here, you can see that there's not too many things that I can change by default, but I am still able to custom set the Z-axis, for instance, and set its position in the world. I might also want to rotate it and have it facing that way. So I can just punch in those things directly and will automatically be set. Again, you can press End to drop it to the ground. So with that in mind, I'm going to actually go ahead and start making some changes here. I'm going to first off go to this section over here. Now this is the Modes panel. Within the Modes panel, we have access to a variety of different tools. We have Place, Paint, Landscape, Foliage, and Geometry Editing. So for this section, we're primarily going to be working with the geometry tools and the placement tools, and we'll leave the others for later. Now, for this first project, what I'm going to want you to do is click on this button down here that says Geometry. Upon doing so, you'll be greeted by these things here. This allows me to make a box brush, a cone brush, cylinder, stairs, or sphere. Now what that means is if I was to get this box and left click and drag it into the world, I can see that it's now in the world. Now, the reason I want you to know how to do this is that, first off, I can see there are some attributes over here. If I was to punch in 400, it's automatically stretched this box out along that x-axis. At any stage, you can click this little yellow arrow and it will reset it to the default values. Now, there's another way to modify this, and this is, in my opinion, the far more useful way, and that is you can go to Geometry Editing mode. When I click on Geometry Editing mode, you'll see each face is now turned blue. And the reason for that is I'm now able to click on a face and just drag it out. Click and drag. So with that in mind, we're now able to see that we can construct some things. But I'm sure many of you are going, well, so what? You're just resizing a box. Well, that's fine. Let's click here. And this time I'm going to go and click on Extrude. You're going to get a warning the first time this happens that warns you that extrusions only happen in local coordinate systems, and that's fine. Just click Don't Show Me this again. What that warning is essentially telling you is that when you pull out a face, you're pulling them in local space, not in world space, which means forward is relative to the angle that the surface was currently facing. I'll get more on this later. So if I was to hold down Extrude, and I was to click here and drag out, you'll notice something different happened. And what happened is that this time, instead of stretching the face to that location, what it did instead was it extended a new set of vertices, which are these corner points, out to that location and added some new faces in. So these can be selected now independently of one another. I'm able to click here and drag upwards. And you can see once again, it's extended out. And if I was to click here, again. Now, the reason I've brought this up is that I'm going to go back to edit mode, clicking on here. And I'm just going to really quickly select these. And to do that, I clicked on one, I held Control and left clicked on the other. And what that did is instead of selecting the faces, it just grabbed those 2 points. The reason that's useful is that if I was to pull this out, you can see that we can now get an angled brush. Now, we can do more than just adding these things. I'm going to drag in a new thing, and to do that, I'm going to go to Place. And this time, for the sake of demonstration, I'm going to go Geometry, and I'm going to drop in a sphere. Now this sphere, I'm going to overlap with our geometry just here. And at the moment, you can see that we have, not the best sphere, but it's a good start. I'm going to increase the tessellation here, just to make something that's a little more rounded. But I'm also going to click here. See where it says additive? I'm going to change that to subtractive. Now if I click off that object, you can now see that what it's done has carved out our geometry. So this initial process of carving out geometry is very, very useful because it allows you to very quickly set something up. Now, I know it's very unlikely that in your game you're going to have a giant sea to carve out, but a good example would be I could easily build a bridge and carve out a tunnel in it. So I want you to go ahead and do that. Now, one quick thing that's going to have happened, when I deleted the box, I can no longer see the sphere. I know it's still there, but I can't see it. Now there are 2 ways to go about handling this situation. I could click here on the sphere brush, which is in my world outliner that I showed you before, or alternatively, I'm actually able to go up to the top here and see where it says lit. I can change that to wireframe. Now you'll notice that next to each of these is an Alt key, Alt 4, 3, 2, 5, and 6. If I was to press Alt 2, it would do the same thing as selecting it here. It's a really quick shortcut for you to move between modes. So I'm going to click wireframe, at which point we can now see the world represented as a wireframe. I can now actually just click on the object directly, and I can hit delete. To go back to it just then, I hit Alt 4. If you don't want to do that, you can always go here and click on lit. Now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to quickly make myself a bridge or a walkway for someone to go along. Now I want to point out at this point that when I drop this in, it's not exactly cleanly snapping to the grid. When I drop in the box, it's moving not comfortably around this area. I really would like it snapping to these squares. Now the reason it's not doing that is up here. See this section that says set position grid snap? I'm going to click on that. I'm going to go down and set it to a grid size of 100. Now these units are in Unreal units, but Unreal units are directly proportional to centimeters. So 100 means 100 centimeters. If I click on that and I drag in a box, you can now see that it's perfectly snapped to these grid tiles. And if I was to move it, it would automatically snap to the next tile. Now for this bridge, I'm going to put this here, I'm going to set it up, I'm going to quickly just extend this across. So I'm going to go back to geometry mode. And you can move between these modes with Shift 1 and Shift 5 as a shortcut. So I'm going to click there, I'm going to extend it to 2 blocks beforehand. Oops, I wasn't in extrude mode. So I'm going to click here and go to extrude mode. I'm going to pull out one more time. And now I'm going to put this to here. And on this side, I'm going to pull this out to here. Now I've got this shape going on. What I'm going to do at this point is go back to my geometry tools, and I'm going to add myself a staircase. So I'm going to drag in a linear staircase. And you'll see that it just looks like this. You can set the number of steps, you can set the height of each step, etc., to be whatever you desire. But in this case, I think the defaults are actually probably good. So I've added a staircase there. Now I'm going to add another one over here. And while I could just drag in a staircase again, what I want to actually do instead is hold down the Alt key and drag. So while holding Alt and dragging, I end up over here. And it duplicates the object automatically. Do you see that? I'm now going to hit spacebar, and I'm going to rotate it around 180 degrees on the Z-axis. Spacebar, spacebar, and I'm going to set this up so that it's the same on either side. Now the final thing that I'm going to do here is I'm going to get a cylinder. I'm going to drop that in, I'm going to hit the spacebar, and I'm going to rotate my cylinder this way. Now the reason for that is this cylinder is going to end up being the guts of my bridge. So I'm going to put this here, at which points I'm going to lower it down. Now, if I was to click here and go to subtractive, we would carve out something that looked like this. Now, that works, except that you've got the world's worst bridge. So instead, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to get my cylinder brush. To get that just then, I clicked in the world outliner. Again, if you want to be able to select it, you can hit Alt-2 to go to wireframe mode, and then you can just click on the brush. If things are getting complicated and you don't want to see things in your scene, you can always click on them and hit H to hide them. So I'm going to click on the floor and hit H to hide it. Now, if you want them back, you can hit Control H and they'll come back into the world. But this is a nice way to quickly just focus on some of the things that you actually care about. So I've got this, and I can see that where it subtracts geometry runs flush with the top here. Now this is one of those instances where what I would actually suggest you do is I'm going to go back to my grid size and I'm going to set it to 10 centimeters instead of 100. And by doing that, I'm now able to move this down exactly 10 centimeters. I'm also going to set this back to 100 now because I really want to make sure that everything that I'm doing predominantly stays on the grid. Now I've gone back to my view and I can't see the sky dome and I can't see the floor. And the reason for that is that I've still got them hidden. So I can hit Control H and they'll pop back. But most importantly, what I've done right now is we've created ourselves a nice bridge. And if I was to hit play, I will now be a floating thing. And if I run into this surface, it's not going to let me pass. But if I want to go under the bridge, no worries. Now these tools are used primarily for just blocking out the environment. You really don't want to rely on having too many of these in your final piece. Typically what happens is you block out your geometry this way, and then you'll go back later and convert them to static meshes to make them more efficient. Now that we've covered geometry tools, we're going to be looking at static mesh placement in the next section. You'll notice that when I carved out my geometry, the floor didn't get carved. Now the reason the floor wasn't carved is because the floor itself is actually a 3D model that's been imported in. If I was to click on it, I can see that it is actually a static mesh actor. So even though this is a simple mesh, it will still work to illustrate the point. I'm going to click on this little magnifying glass next to static mesh, and that's automatically going to take my content browser down the bottom to the asset. I'm then going to double click on it, and I can see, for anyone that missed what I just did, I grabbed on this and I docked it with the top so that it would be part of my main window. You can see that the 3D object is just this. Now, any good looking mesh in the game is going to be a 3D object that's been imported in. You don't really carve things out that are like fine geometry using the geometry tools. So I'm going to give you an example of how that works. But first up, what I want to do is I'm going to click on this button here, which says Show or Hide Sources panel. It's on the left-hand side of your content browser. And that's going to give me the full proper content browser view. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go Content, ArcViz, Mesh, and I can see within this mesh folder we have a bunch of different static meshes. So I'm going to open up this couch. Now first up we have this couch. Now this couch represents a 3D object that's been imported into the game. If I was to click on wireframe mode, you can see that it is very, very dense with a whole bunch of different polygons that have been cut in to get a very nice shape. This isn't the kind of thing that you would make with your standard geometry toolset. I can click collision, and I can see that the couch has some very basic collision. It's got a standard box collision around it, and then it's also got this much tighter collision that is the complex collision. They're differentiated by the colors, and they're used for different purposes. I'll go into them later though. Now over here we have the materials that are being applied to the couch, and if I was to go to this and click the isolate button, highlight button, it's going to show you where that material is being used. This one is being used on the couch surface itself, but you'll notice that there are two materials, and the reason for that is the legs. If I was to click highlight on the legs, you'll notice that this material here is being set to these. So I can hear some of you asking, what is a material? And the best way for me to describe that is actually with a different asset. I'm going to close down my couch, and I'm going to open up this asset called mug. And now when I do so, you'll see that we're greeted with a rather conventional 3D mug. Now the reason I wanted you to look at this is, first off, if I was to get this asset's material, up on the top right it says m_mug, and I was to click this magnifying glass, it would open it in my content browser. So I'm going to go back to here, and in my content browser I can see that m_mug has been selected. Now I'm going to double click on that, and what we're greeted with is this, which is our first material. Now, essentially a material is a shader. So a material is what you use to wrap textures around a 3D object. If you imagine any object that you get, remember that when you color it, it essentially has to be colored using a texture of some sort, so a two-dimensional image. So you have to wrap this two-dimensional image around a three-dimensional image, and we use shaders to do that. And not only are they used to apply the textures themselves, but they're also used to then add other settings. Now, a good example in this case is if I zoom in here, we can see that we have our Epic Games mug. Now, if I was to get this, I can see that over here we have a logo for Epic Games, which is interacting with some other nodes and eventually runs into this base color. Now, I'm not going to go into the material editor too much here, but I will show you some of the changes that I'm referring to. If I click on mug color, so if I was to change this to, let's just say as an example, a orange, and I was to set this alpha value to 1, we're now going to get a mug that looks like this. So this is the way that you can create one 3D asset and one simple texture, but use various parameters to change how things look. Now, I'm very briefly going to go into what we're seeing here, but I'm going to cover this more in depth at another stage. Essentially what we have here is a texture sample that if I was to right click on and hit start previewing, the editor will now show me what it looks like just with this node being calculated. And you can see that it is white with an Epic Games logo. Now, this texture, if I was to open it within Unreal, looks like this. I'm sure you can see that something's missing. And the reason is that colors in Unreal, or textures, aren't stored as just red, green, and blue like they would be in a conventional image of something. They also store what's called an alpha layer, which is actually typically used to store the opacity of something, so how transparent it is. If I get rid of the opacity layer, you can now see that the logo's here. Now what this means is that if I was to just look at the alpha channel, I would get this. And what this essentially is a nice outline of where the logo is meant to go. Now I'm going to go back to the material, and you can see here that we have red, green, blue, and then there's this little gray one down the bottom. Now what this means is that on a texture sample, the white pin represents red, green, and blue. The gray pin represents the alpha channel. Essentially what it's saying here is the alpha layer runs into what's called a lerp, or a linear interpolation. And all this does is whenever something is black in the texture that goes into the alpha, make it this thing. Whenever something is white, make it this thing, which essentially combines the colors together to create this. Finally, to get the rest of the look, all that they've done is added some extra parameters to set up a normal map, which is used to create subtle bumps around the surface of the object, or in this case, to round out the object. This is something we're not going to be covering in this tutorial. They're also adding in a texture to calculate the ambient occlusion so that it has some just slight darknesses in the model where these vertices come together, just to create a slightly more realistic effect. Now this, again, isn't stuff that we're really going to cover too much in this initial presentation, but we will cover later. So I'm going to close down my mug asset. I'm not going to save my changes because I'd rather keep the mugs black for the time being. And I think it's about time for us to start looking at creating our first map. So for this first map, I'm going to need you to click File, New Level, and I want you to create an empty level. With an empty level, what we're essentially going to be doing is carving out geometry at the very beginning that's going to represent kind of a clean slate for our map. So initially what we're going to be doing is laying out the floors, laying out the walls, and laying out the roof. For this first piece, what I'm going to be doing is carving out the floor. Now, to carve out the floor, what we're going to need to do is once again go back to our geometry tools. So place, geometry, and I want you to drop a box into the scene. Now, initially, I'm going to get this box and I'm just going to drop it down so that it's flush against the floor. Do you see that? This grid, it's now, the top of it is touching the grid. So the reason I got you to do that is that I want you to go to the geometry tool setting and we're going to start expanding this out. Now, I could do it in this view and start pulling out walls and such. But the other way that I could do this is if I wanted to, I could go perspective, top, and now we're shown an orthographic viewport that lets me actually do things from a perfectly top-down view. This means I can move the box to here, for instance. Oops, the center of the grid. And I could then click, and whenever I select one of these lines, it actually selects the lines that are perfectly parallel with it. So the first thing that we're going to be doing is laying out this floor. And this floor is going to be quite large. So I'm going to get something and I'm going to pull it across to be about this big. This is something that we can tinker with later on. But I'm going to pull it across so that it is 2 of these larger grid spaces across. And then going down, I might do the same so that we have a square area. So if I wanted to, I could always go from from top view back to perspective. Now, it's at this point that I really want to point out that whenever you're carving up a map, it's really, really important for you to have perspective. If you don't have perspective, this entire thing can be a very frustrating experience. So I'm going to click on Mesh, and I'm going to drag myself a couch into the map. Now when I've dragged in the couch, we can now see how big our room currently is. And it's pretty large. But that's okay, because we're going to be building walls around it and going from there. So to add walls, we're once again going to just drag in some boxes using the geometry tools. Going to drop this in. And I'm going to do this from the top-down view. So I'm going to click perspective and change it to top. And I'm going to size this up. So I'm going to go to my geometry editing mode. And I'm quickly just going to lay this out so that we have something very basic inside of our world. That's a good start. I'm going to go back to my place menu. Now remember, you can always hold down Alt and drag. And you can now see that I have a perfect duplicate of this wall here. I'm going to use that as a basis and hold down Alt and rotate, which allows me to size this up, which is currently going to need to be shortened a little bit. That's okay. Oops. So I'm going to go back to my perspective, and I can see that we have the beginnings of my walls here. Once again, I'm going to Alt drag and just pop this over here. Now, the first obvious issue with what we have is that if these were walls to a room, they're not exactly, the right height. So the question is how tall should we make something like this? So this is where, again, a point of reference really comes in handy. I'm going to drag in this doorway and put it here. So this doorway I know is perfectly sized and it is the correct height for a standard doorway. So I'm going to modify my walls to be taller to kind of match that. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to select by holding down Control and clicking on just each of these blocks. And I'm going to go to my geometry editing mode, at which point I'm going to select all of the faces. And I'm just going to drag them up a little bit. Whichever face that you select last is the one that the widget will stay on. So I'm going to actually select this one last. And if I was to drag this up, we would now be presented with a room that was around this size, which I'm reasonably comfortable with, actually. We could potentially go higher and go for a really high ceiling and then cut down wherever we want to, but this is probably okay for the time being. So with that in mind, we're now going to start kind of playing with our space a little bit and getting a general idea of what we actually want to have as a setup for our room. Now, one thing that's worth mentioning here is that instead of flicking between the views, if you'd like to, you can click this button at the very top, which will simultaneously show you the left, front, top, and perspective views. So if I click here, you can see that it's been selected from all different directions. So I'm going to stick to viewport for the time being while I kind of lay out the fundamentals of my room, and then we're going to go backwards from there. The other thing that's I'm just going to leave out is I'm not going to touch the roof for the time being because I'm probably going to try and carve something interesting into that. Now for this initial area, what we're essentially going to do is create a reasonably small room. And I'm going to have a couch that's going to be sitting here. Other way around. And I'm going to make this like a standard family room. So I'm going to alt click. And I'm going to have another couch that's sitting over here. Oh, that's probably good enough. I'm going to drag in a couple of other 3D objects. So again, I'm going to drag in my coffee table. And these are all going to get relocated later, but this is going to be my initial grounding for this space. I'd really like to have this door kind of pulled over here so that they had to kind of walk past these things as they went. And I'm probably going to make this area significantly smaller. So I'm going to get the door, and I'm going to put another door probably around here. So this means we're going to end up with a space around this size. Since I've got the couches in there, it'd be nice if we added a chair. So I'm going to drag that in, spacebar. I'm just going to rotate it into somewhere that looks vaguely nice. Again, we'll be fixing this later. And because we've got the couches and the chair here, I'm going to set myself up to eventually have some sort of television here. Now, to drag in the TV, I'm going to drag it in. Again, I'm going to rotate it. I'm going to pull it back. Now, for obvious reasons, this isn't really the best way for us to have set up this space, but that's okay. Whenever you're doing these things, you're going to make 1,000,001 adjustments, because as you start carving it out, you're going to get a better idea of what you need to do. So in this situation, I've got a door here, couch, chair, tabletop, TV. Now, if you want to follow along, I'm going to switch to top. I'm going to zoom in. And I'm just going to leave this on screen for a second so you can copy this into your own if you choose to. Now, from here on in, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start relocating these things so that they're in a slightly more comfortable sizing. The first thing that I can see I'm going to need to do is clearly bring in all of my walls because I was totally overeager when I anticipated how big I actually wanted to make this room. So I'm going to go to place mode. I'm going to drag select all of those objects, but not the TV. And we're going to pull them in to about here. Now, if I was to go back to my perspective mode, I can now see that this is a little bit closer to what we want, although I may have been a little bit overeager. Pull it back 1 meter more. That feels nice. Yep, we'll go with that. So this is going to be my initial area. I'm now going to get this, and I'm going to pull this wall in to here. I'm going to get this. I'm going to pull it in to here. And while I'm at it, I'm just going to quickly resize a lot of these things. Again, I'm just selecting the necessary faces in geometry mode. Oops. Now, if we wanted to do more rooms, we could always go ahead and actually, keep the floor the size it is. But I know I'm probably going to be leaving it like this for the most part. So for the time being, I'm going to shrink this down to the smallest size it needs to be, just to make my life a little bit easier. So now we have the basics of our room. We're going to plan out some other things now as well. So I really want to have some sort of light kind of coming in through here, and that's going to be like a nice sunlight or evening light coming in from over there. The other thing that I'm going to do is we may crack open this door so that we have ourselves a hallway going on. I know I'm going to have some lamps around the place and some other things, but I'm going to keep this reasonably clean and reasonably simple. So it's at this point that I'm going to take myself out of the unlit mode. Problem is I have no lights. So I'm going to go to my place menu and I'm going to click on lights. And I'm going to drag these into the scene. Now, these are what I call work lights. What I've dragged in was a point light, but I'm not really going to bother setting them up. I'm putting them in more so I can get kind of a feel of the space itself and have a general idea of how things are laid out. So I'm going to alt drag a couple of work lights around the space until they, correctly illuminate everything. Also, one useful tip is whenever you're working like this, I often tap G to see how it looks as if it was in the game. So it gets rid of all of the editor looking elements on this. So G to tap into game mode, G to tap off. You can also do it through here, game view. So we've got the beginnings of our space, and it's at this point that I'm going to start making things kind of a little bit more interesting. I think the first port of call is really going to be making sure that we have some nice lighting going on from outside this doorway. So I'm going to drag this sliding doors asset over to here. And this is going to eventually end up being where my sun's shining through. Now, the obvious issue that we're going to have if we do this is that, well, I have a wall in the way of my sun. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to drag in under geometry, I'm going to drag in a box, and I'm going to set this to be a subtractive box. You can now see that this carves the whole way through our wall. So the first thing that I'm going to need to do is look at this and kind of shrink down the subtraction brush to be the correct size of this doorway. So I'm going to click here and I'm going to go to my set position, my snap size, and I'm going to drop it to a 5 centimeter snap. I'm then going to go to my geometry tool and click here. And I'm now going to bring this all the way back so that it's very, very thin. Now it's hard to see, but I think that will line up. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to select each edge of the subtraction brush. Again, if you can't see it, you can always go to wireframe mode and select the correct brush. And I'm just going to pull these out so that they kind of meet where the door ends are, just like the top. So for anyone, again, that's forgetting, it's Alt-2 to go to wireframe mode. Which one I'm going to go back into lit mode. We can now see that that's carved in and running reasonably well flush against the edge of this. We'll have a better idea in just a moment. So the next thing that I'm going to do is kind of carve out how this open area looks. Obviously this wall is massive. No one actually has a wall this big. So I'm going to get this wall and I'm going to pull it in as well. So I'm going to go to a 10 centimeter snap grid and I'm going to bring it to about there. So that's reasonably thin. You can see if I go into unlit mode that that's how thin my wall is. Now that my wall's resized, I'm going to pull out and relocate this doorway so that it's just inside of the edges here. So I'm going to go to a 5 centimeter snap grid. And I can see that it's currently doing that. I'm just going to move it over so that it's now sitting inside the wall correctly. The other thing that I've gone ahead and I'm going to do is I'm going to select my subtraction brush. And I can see that there's a slight issue whereby the brush is currently not reaching the end. I thought it did, but it's not. And let's do that on both sides because, hey, if I'm going to make a mistake, I might as well make it twice, right? So I'm going to go to wireframe mode. And it looked like it was just 5 centimeters across. Would probably do the trick. So I'm going to do that on both. I went 10. You can now see that's ending inside of the door. And the other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go here. I'm going to select the back face of my subtraction brush. Again, it's a little bit occluded by this static mesh, so I'm just going to get rid of the static mesh for the time being with the H key. And I'm just going to resize this to be the size of the doorway. So we've now got ourselves a nice little doorway. And I'm actually going to go ahead and I'm going to drop in a temporary directional light that's going to act as just my sun, so I know how this is going to start looking. So I'm going to go back to my place menu, lights, and I'm going to drop in a directional light actor. Hit spacebar, and you'll see that wherever I rotate this to, it's going to kind of have the sun coming in from that direction. And I think this would look best if we had like the doorway kind of casting some cool shadows going straight across the room. So it's at this point that I am going to go ahead and create a roof so I can get a better idea of how this is going to be looking. I'm going to set my snap grid to 100. I'm going to alt drag upwards. And you'll see that that's nicely snapped to the roof because we stayed on the grid. And we've got this going on, which looks okay. Thinking I'm going to go to a 50 centimeter snap grid and move this across as well. Actually, just give them a little bit more space as they kind of come in that door. Cool. So with that in mind, let's start looking at what we can do to kind of make this room a little bit more interesting. So now that we've blocked out the room, we're going to move into the finer details. To begin with, I'm going to go to my materials section and I'm going to set myself up with some walls. So for the walls, we're going to look around the materials and you'll see that there's one that is called wall pane interior matte inst. Now this is a material and all I have to do is hold down left click and drag it onto a surface to apply it. I'm going to do that again and again. And again, my 4 walls. Next up, I'm going to go from here to start looking at what I'm going to do with the roof. Actually, you know what? Let's do the roof as well. It's a nice white. And I'm now going to go delete the search term I had, which was wall. And instead, I'm going to do a quick search for floor. You see that one of them is wood floor matte inst. So I'm just going to connect that to here. Don't worry about the outside, we'll fix that up later. And we've now got ourselves a nice floor and some walls. So if we wanted this to look like a real space, the quickest way for us to kind of start doing that is going to be, well, to kind of make it a little bit messier. So what I mean by that is, let's actually get these 4 walls and start carving them out a little bit, because how often do you actually have 4 perfectly square walls inside of your room? Typically you're actually going to have like little things carving in because there's closet space somewhere, or there's going to be a staircase behind it that's forced a wall to be pushed in, or a chimney perhaps, etc, etc. So I'm going to start carving out my space in a slightly more interesting way, and you can do this however you want to, but feel free to follow along with how I'm doing it so that you've got something to kind of compare it to. This initial space, I'm going to go back to my geometry tools, my geometry placement, and I'm going to drop in a box over here. Now, because I had the floor selected as my last my last material, it's going to go ahead and apply that to the box that I dropped in. I kind of don't want that. I'm going to set it to be the pane interior instead, and I'm going to go ahead and drop this in, at which point I'm going to start working out how best to have this fitted. My gut says something that's very nice and snug against the wall, probably even more snug than what I'm seeing right there. Probably when I go to this, I'm going to go to a 10 centimeter snap grid, and I'm just going to pull this in until we're about 20 centimeters from the wall itself. I'm also going to run that all the way up to the roof. And I'm thinking I'll run it to the side further. I might just place it like this. So we kind of have it sticking out like that. I'm going to move this television. This means that I could theoretically have like a painting or something sitting there. I could have a nice lamp sitting over here. and potentially like a table in front of this. So I think that's going to come along all right. So I'm going to go from there, and I'm going to add that painting because I really like the idea of it. So this is going to sit around here. Yeah, that'll look alright when I'm done. Cool. I'm also going to have like a standing lamp sitting in the corner. Keep in mind that all of our lighting is currently temporary. We're going to be adjusting it as we go. Put a pop lamp in there for good measure. It's a good idea whenever you add something like a pop lamp to go ahead and add a second one somewhere, because typically these things kind of come in twos. Gonna grab my lamp and follow my own advice. So Alt drag. Probably be nice to have another one of these somewhere over in the corner, but I feel like this is another one of those things that we could probably make a little bit messier. So I'm gonna go ahead and add another wall along here. So I'm just gonna select this one and just drag it across because I know it's the correct size. And something like that would probably do reasonably well. I'm going to connect this all the way over to the wall. Oops, I wasn't in geometry mode. Going to run this all the way over to the wall so that we've got something nice. Adding a little bit of disruption to the room. Looks okay. Then gonna get my shelving, drag this in. I'm just gonna quickly add some bookcases along the wall here. Something that, you know, as you walked in, you would see. I'm gonna Alt drag, so we've got two of these next to each other. Make it look like a larger case. Now here's one of the first things you'll find when it comes to modeling. Quite often you don't have a model, but you do have something very similar to what you want. So for instance, I have this bookcase, but if I turn it sideways, I have a TV stand. Doesn't matter that it's under the ground. No one's ever going to know. No one's ever going to see. This can be our little secret. I'm also going to move these across a bit because they're now not in the best alignment with the rest of my room. Yeah, that looks okay. I've got a fair bit of space over here on this side, actually. I'll figure that out in a bit. So I've got that going on. I've got a nice lamp over there. And I'm going to go ahead and add like a rug underneath this lamp. So carpet. So I'm just going to drag this until we get into a position that's quite nice. I think it might even look better to have it a little further that way. You know, it's at times like this that I actually almost feel like my room is still too big. So again, I'm just going to eyeball this stuff. So as long as you're kind of vaguely close to what I'm doing, then we're all good. I'm going to set this to be a 100 centimeter snap grid, and I'm just going to go into wireframe mode and kind of just pull everything in by 2 meters or 1 meter in. So I'm going to grab this entire wall, just move it across a meter. This mesh across a meter. This mesh. And the good news is you know, I can do this now, and if I was building off of an actual plan, this wouldn't matter quite as much. There we go. It's a bit more snug. Yeah, I like that more. So we're gonna go out of geometry mode. I'm gonna set my snap grid to be a little smaller so it's easy to place things around the world. Yep, that's good. So again, I'm just going to keep going through and just adding general clutter. I know a lot of this stuff seems kind of boring, but it's a good idea to know how to do it. So again, that went too high initially, but by pressing the end key, it fell down onto the floor and got to the correct size for something that would, be sitting along there. I'm gonna go ahead and just, okay, so if I look at this painting, I'm gonna drag this in. You'll see that it's called M Painting 1. Sorry, M Frame 1 with the material M Painting 1. And if I click on Painting 1, there's actually a bunch of different paintings that I can swap this out with. So in this instance, I'm going to go with something like this one. And I'm going to set it to be scaled up. Now before I showed you this tool, but I didn't really go into it too much. If I go to my scale widget by hitting space, or I can select it from up here, I'm able to actually click and resize the object. Now at the moment, I've made a bit of a mistake that I'm not actually 90 degrees. I thought I was, but I was negative 100 instead of negative 90. So I just typed it in manually there. I could have used the rotation widget, but I wanted to be sure. So I'm now able to kind of get this, put it up here as like a big painting of some sort. I might change these numbers to be straight 2, 1, 2. Now this scales it on different axes. So if I set this to 5, it's going to stretch out to be 5 times the length going that way as to it normally is. If I set this one to 5, it's going to be 5 times the size upwards as it normally is. So I've gone 2, but I've kept the y-axis as a 1. And the reason for that is that I still want the frame to be pretty thin, which gives us this effect. So I'm going to set this to a 10 centimeter snap grid and just snap it against the wall somewhere. So again, I'm going to keep going through and just drag stuff out, set up a very basic environment. And it's about time that I kind of went and added, thinking some little stands next to the couch could look nice, just something that you'd put a remote on that's from the table just seems too far away. Life's tough. So I'm going to drag this in, and on a whim, going to set it to 0.75, 0.75. Okay, I'll keep that as 1. Now the reason I've set it up like this is I want it to kind of be thinner, and I'm sure many of you are groaning at how I'm using these assets, but it's okay. I'm going to drag this to either side. Now I got a bit of this happening. Looks right. And we can go off and we can put a lamp on top of it. Nice. That lamp's probably a bit too big though, so I'm going to set this lamp to be 0.5, 0.5, 0.5. Now, one thing that's worth noting is this little lock key. So if this lock is checked, when I scale something up, it scales all of the axes at the same time. So see how those numbers are all changing together? But if it's unlocked, I can rescale it on only one axis, which is also very useful. In this case, 0.5 is fine. I'm going to lift it up and hit end so that it drops down onto the floor. And I'm going to copy it over to here. I have one on either side of the table. Now get ourselves some lamps. I kind of want to add another rug, so I'm going to click on this rug, and Alt drag it across. And I'm going to shrink it down a little bit to about 0.75, just so we've got a little bit of differentiation. Also going to rotate it so no one ever notices it's the same rug. Cool. I think finally I'm just going to quickly add some other paintings and then we'll move on to the more interesting stuff. So I'm going to shrink this down. And again, as I showed you before, I can set this to be, maybe it's a little big, maybe a little small. Yep, and I can set this to be a different painting, because we have all sorts of different things there. So that seems good. Got some basics of the room going on. Could really use some curtains. So I've dragged in the curtains, and the curtains are currently extending all the way from the roof. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to this section here, and I'm just going to shrink them until they're at the correct size to, oops, that was way too small. Shrink them so they're the correct size to kind of align with my doorway here. So 0.8 seemed to be my magic number. Actually, I might pull it in so they kind of, no, I'm just going to go smaller grid. Going to need to move it a couple of centimeters out so that we're not clipping with anything. There we go. And I'm going to Alt. Now, before I do this, I actually want this to be flipped because I want this corner to be in this side of it. And the reason I want that is so if I was to click on this one, for instance, and I was to extend it along this axis, it's actually going to stretch out to cover the entire doorway. Do you see that? So I want the same thing for this one. So to do that, I can right-click, transform, and just say mirror along that axis, at which point it perfectly mirrors it for us, which is nice. So that's our nice little curtain area set up. Now, the only other things, I mean, obviously we need to do a higher decoration pass on this, but this is going to be our basic blocking out for our room. The other thing I might do just quickly is I'm going to throw a mess along this ground here to make it look like a little kid's been playing around. So I could manually go through and just place these blocks into the map. So see, I just drag it in and then groan about my life as I do so. Instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the foliage tool. So see this tool up here? If I click on that and I drag these blocks into the foliage tool, what I actually have the ability to do now is, if I zoom out, you can see that the entire world I have a massive circular cursor around it. I'm going to use the square brackets on my keyboard to shrink this down a bit. And you'll see that I'm now greeted with a nice little brush size about this big. Now, if I hold down left click, this actually lets me kind of paint these into the world. Now this is meant to be used for grass and general foliage, but you can really use it in any way that you want to. In this case, it's particularly good for just laying out small objects, like blocks. And if I want to, on any of these, I can actually change things like the radius, the density, so if I crank this number up and then paint, probably going to crash my editor, and I should have thought about that before doing it. Oh, yep, there we go. You can see that it added a ridiculous number. P.S. Don't do what I just did. I'm going to hit Ctrl Z. But as I increase the density, it's going to increase the number of them in an area. I can also use the Shift left click to remove them. So if I look at this and I'm like, oh, my mess should really be over here and away from the area there, I can do so. Again, add a couple of rogue blocks over there, so it looks like this kid that was fooling around has managed to spread their mess all around the room. If some of your blocks are clipping, you can always click on this button here, at which point you can grab any singular block and kind of move it around a little bit, put it somewhere that you think's nice. I want to cast a little shadow from it. And that seems like it'll be okay. Yeah, that'll probably do for my general clutter and mess. And it's at this point that I'm going to leave everyone to be, and I want you to just add some mess to this. Actually, one last thing before we do is I'm going to get this wall over here. I'm going to go back to my place mode. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to make this wall a brick wall. So under content materials, I'm going to tap on the word brick. And I'm just going to set it to this brick blue. The reason for that is I'm going to set this up to be kind of like a general feature wall. So I want you to go through and add your own details. If you're trying to figure out what to do, a good idea is to add books to the room. So you could add all sorts of just like general books to the shelves here. You could add some mugs on the surface, etc., etc. So we'll meet back in just a little bit, and we'll start with our meshed out room. We'll start looking at how to do some lighting. So I've gone through and I've done my detail pass. There's a couple of things that I've done that you'll need to keep track of. First off is to get my lighting not looking completely hideous, which I'm sure you've noticed that some of your walls are doing some very odd things at this point. I've just clicked the build button up the top, which builds your lighting. I've also saved my map. You can do that by just clicking Save Current, or alternatively going File, Save Current As, which will save it as a specific name. In this situation, I've called my demo map pre-lighting, and the reason for that is that I wanted to have a save point that was before I actually started correctly adding my lights to the map. So if I go through here, I'm just going to show you some of the smaller details that I've added. First off, you can see that we've added some tiny things such as the light switches to the walls. We've added books to all of the bookcases, so these have just been added and then manually kind of rotated to look slightly nicer. The material on the books automatically changes the color according to their position. If I go across the room as well, I can see that we've got this. So I've added a coat hook to when you first walk in. I've added this little environment here, which is made to just look like an adjoining corridor. I thought this was nicer since it kind of opened up the space a little bit more. I've added some statues up top and some pot plants down here, as well as a couple of vases. It was kind of sneaky, and I shrunk one of these pot plants and put it in the vase. As well as that, I've gone ahead and I've added this outdoor area. So you can see here that we have just a very simple fence that's running along the outside with just a tile. Now I'm sure you've noticed that I have no material set up for this outside area. So I have no material set up for it because I never want the player to go out there. I only ever want them to see it from this perspective. I've also gone ahead and added a building and an atmospheric area out here. So to do that, the building itself is just a background card, so you can just drop that in this here. I scaled it up to 65 times size, so it's huge, at which point I dropped my camera to about here, placed it in, and then positioned it so that it was nice. To get the atmosphere effect, I went ahead and added an atmospheric fog actor. Now, an atmospheric fog actor is added by just dragging it in from here. I typed in the word Atmo, and atmospheric fog came up, so it's in my place menu, my place mode. When I drop that in, it's automatically going to look similar to this, but not quite the same. And that's because the atmospheric fog simulates what the atmosphere would look like given the sun's position, but it needs to have one very important piece of information, and that is it needs to know where the sun is. So you need to tell it which directional light in your scene is the sun. To do that, it's very simple. You just click on the directional light that you have in your scene, and if you go to your search tab and type in the word Atmo, you'll see that we have atmosphere sunlight is one of the options. If I uncheck that, you'll see what it looks like by default. And then if I check it, it'll automatically put the sun in the correct position so that the rotation of this directional light matches up with where it is in the distance. Now, the atmospheric sun can be tweaked in all sorts of nice ways. I can click sun multiplier and I can crank up just how bright that sun is in the distance. And I can handle all sorts of other areas like how much fog is coming through, the size of the sun disk itself. So, we can really tweak this. In this situation though, I'm just going to keep all of my defaults because it's nice enough for the outdoor environment. We don't really need to modify it too much. Instead, I'm going to go ahead and start actually working on my lighting pass. So with that said, can you save your map and make sure that you've saved it something that is like pre-lighting? And once you've done so, we're going to, in the next session, start going through and adding lighting and then post-processing. So now that it's time to actually light the map, it's a good idea for us to go File, and I'm going to File and Save Current As, and I'm going to call mine Demo Map Post Lighting. And the reason for that is I want to save it so it's something that whenever I save, I've got something that I can fall back on that's before lighting. Now, you don't need to do this, it's up to you. If you want, you can just keep powering ahead, but I like to kind of keep checkpoints of where things were. It's also good for later if you want to see how the environment progressed. So the first thing I want everyone to do is go through, and we're going to go ahead and delete the lights around the map. So all of the point lights, we'll keep the directional light for the time being, but I want you to go through and just remove any point lights that are still sitting there within your scene. Hit delete, and then I'm going to go up to the top, and I'm going to click Build. Now, in building lighting, it's just going to cast all of the lighting into the world, and you should get something that looks vaguely like this. that's basically what we want to have for our starting position. The first thing that we're going to do is basically focus on this light and then go from there. So I'm going to click on my directional light. At the moment I've still got my filter when I was looking for my atmospheric sunlight, and I can remove that by clicking on the X. And when I get into this, I can see that there are some things that we can tweak and change. Now the first thing that I want to do is I want to activate a feature called cascading shadow maps. Now see how at the moment when my light comes in it looks like this? It's not exactly pretty, and it's definitely not how the sun should really be looking. So I'm going to scroll down and you'll see that there is a section here called Cascaded Shadow Maps. Now, how Cascaded Shadow Maps work is they basically project a dynamic shadow from the sun that is a much clearer and harder shadow than you would get if you were to bake things in. When you bake in lighting, it automatically kind of blurs between the values, which can look okay, but it's definitely not the result you want most of the time. So here's an example of how cascading shadow maps work. I'm going to turn this number to 200. And if I start approaching the shadows, you can see that whenever a shadow from the sun is 200 units away from me, it starts bringing in a nicer version. Now, in a game, it would really matter about how optimized we were with this value. For instance, if I did 500, I would need to be aware that, things are going to change at a distance. It doesn't matter so much for architectural visualization, but there are some values that you should be aware because of it. So for this, I've already gone ahead and put in a couple of base values, but the defaults look like this. Now, the first thing that I want to show you after the dynamic shadow distance is this one down the bottom that says distance fade out fraction. Now, if I was to set this to 0.5, you can see that the blend between static shading and dynamic shading is much, much, much longer. If I go 1, then it never is truly fully dynamic. It's always fading out over the course of its shadow. Do you see that? Now, if on the other hand I was to set that to 0 and move backwards, you can see that there is a very harsh line where the two of them are meeting, so where the static comes in. So in my situation, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to keep this distance fraction to be about 0.2, and I'm going to increase the dynamic shadow distance to just about 2000, because this I know will always capture the entire map, so it should look pretty good all the time. Now there are some other things we can do. For instance, we could change the number of dynamic shadow cascades. This essentially is going to create a lower or higher res shadow map on your scene, which can look really good, but can be something that increasing the numbers doesn't always increase the quality, but it does definitely increase the rendering cost. So you really want to be careful about how you do this. It basically kind of splits the shadow into a couple of maps and bakes them out separately. To be honest, the default values are usually pretty good here, and unless you're having some serious issues, it's not worth tweaking. If I increase this or decrease this, I can change how they blend between one another with this transition fraction. So those are all very useful values, but 9 times out of 10 I'm keeping them pretty close to the defaults, apart from enabling it with a specific shadow distance and controlling how soon those fade out. So we've now got this happening, and it's about time for us to now add a light mass importance volume around our environment. So to do that, I'm going to go up to here in my placement, and I'm going to type in light. And you'll see that one of them is called a light mass importance volume. And when I drag this into my scene, we have this. Now essentially a light mass importance volume is used to tell the scene where the actual lighting that we care about in our environment is. So it's kind of telling us where the main level is. So you always want to wrap this snugly around your map without too much overflow. 1000 was almost right for me, but I'm going to go 1200, which is probably a little bit too big, but not too bad. So I'm going to go 1200 by 1200, so I know I've got a big box around the map. And I'm going to increase the height to be, I'm going to call 400 to be safe. Cool. Now, after we add the light mass importance volume, which just gives us more accurate lighting results, I'm going to go ahead and I'm also going to add something called a light mass portal. Now, light mass portals were added a couple of versions ago, and they're one of those things that kind of sneaks into the engine that people don't really know about, so it's really, really important to use them. So you can see that when we've finished building lighting, the light mass importance volume has more accurately calculated how light should be bouncing around the room, and we're getting this extra light around here, which is substantially nicer than what we had when we did our first bake, where it was a stark black on light contrast. So I'm going to add my light mass portal, which essentially tells the game, if you're casting light near me, make sure that I put a whole lot of light through this area is in an accurate way. So it's a good way to essentially denote where windows are, or in my case, transparent doors, so that the game correctly calculates lighting going through those things. And that's because that typically when you do something like this, your windows, you always want to have like nice natural lighting, coming through them. So it's a good idea to kind of tell them where your area actually is and let it kind of adapt to it accordingly. So the values that I need for this are 120 on the Z, and I'm going to call it 140 on the Y just to be a little bit more accurate. I'm going to call 20 on the X as well, just so I know that I've definitely encompassed that entire opening. Now, when I hit build, this should give us slightly nicer results. It might be a little bit hard to see initially, but believe me, when you have more windows, this really can make quite a difference. So with those in place, we're going to start looking at how we handle the actual smaller sublights within our scene. We have lighting now kind of coming in, casting some nice shadows on the scene, but it's about time that we start looking at these lights that I've placed on the roof and putting some actual projections to them. I went and added the SM round ceiling light to the world. I also went through and changed its material from the ceiling light matte inst to ceiling light matte lit inst. And if you see the difference there, it's that versus that. And it's at this point that I'm going to go through and I'm going to start adding some spotlights to these to kind of correspond with what we're seeing. You know, we can have an emissive looking object, but if there's no light coming off of it, then we clearly have something wrong. So I'm going to drag in my first spotlight, and I'm just going to place this to make sure that it's flush against... There we go. So about there. Now, one thing that's worth noting here is that the reason I place these lights close to the walls is I really like this effect of illuminating an object within the scene. If I was to get this same object and alt drag across to here, you can see that again we can kind of create this really nice effect, especially along something like a feature wall. So initially, how a spotlight works is it projects light through this cone up until the point where it reaches its attenuation distance. So see how at the end of this, it's projecting light all the way through to here? We don't want that. We want to make sure that our lights are set up as snugly as possible and they're not going too far. So I'm going to set this to 400 as that kind of nicely goes beneath the floor, but only just by a little margin. And I'm going to set that on both lights. I think the overall radius of the lights is probably okay. We can tweak that later if need be. But essentially what I'm going to do for the time being is click on each of these, and I'm going to alt drag across and just place all of my lights within the map. It's worth noting that it's a good idea to make sure things like lights kind of align in a logical way. The reason being is that because lights are typically placed by architects, they're not kind of added in a free-form way. They're usually spaced out, in theory, rather nicely. So I'm going to add that there, and I'm going to drag this over here and just add some more of these around. Now, because this section of my roof, because it dips down a bit, I'm going to have to make sure that I dip my light down to correspond with that. And I'm going to go ahead and add this other one here. Now, before I go any further, I'm going to go ahead and change one other thing, which is I'm going to go Window and enable World Settings. And after I've done that, I'm going to go to my World Settings, and I'm going to scroll down until I get to this section called Light Mass. Okay? Now, within my Light Mass section, there's a section that says Number of Indirect Lighting Bounces. And by default, how it works is light is calculated by bouncing from here onto the surface, and then it bounces to somewhere else in the room. And it does this 3 times. But I'm going to crank this up to 100, just to make sure that any subtle lighting that would be bouncing around the room is captured nicely. And I'm going to now build lighting for the first time with these in my scene. Fantastic. So you can see that by adding those into the world, we kind of get this nice vibrant lighting kind of pushing out that has a nice split between the artificial lighting, which is these lights, and the natural lighting that's coming in from the window, which is this nice sun. So we can see that everything is reasonably well lit, but there is a nice distinguishable line between the two. The other thing that I think is probably worthwhile us doing is getting a couple of these lights and lighting this interior area that I added. Now if you haven't added the interior area, that's fine. But because I've got it, I'm going to quickly drop these in. And I should probably add one down the end as well. So I'm setting these up. You can see that I'm getting an X here. And the reason for that is that by default, these assets can only overlap up to 4 other stationary lights. So at the moment, I'm using stationary lighting. I could use static or movable. Essentially how this works is if you add a movable light is completely dynamic, and it renders all of the shadows dynamically, and you can remove them and add them to the world, and they look good, but you definitely don't want to use them as an environmental light, purely because their shadows don't have all of this nice pre-baking. Now, next up we have a stationary light, which is somewhere in between a static and a movable light. So a stationary light can't move, and it allows you to do partially baked lighting. It gives you nice dynamic shadows from objects in the scene if you want to, and it can also be tweaked, so you can change things like the color of stationary lights as you go. Finally, we have static light. There's fully balanced baked into the world, but it can't be changed in any way at runtime. I don't mind too much about having this light here as a static light, and as this light here also as a static light, because it's only going to be like subtle lighting that's coming out of here. It's kind of this extra area that's stacked in the background. Now, the reason that most of these are currently still overlapping is if I select them all, I'm sure you'll see the issue. If I scroll down, you can see that they're just overlapping by a tiny fractional amount on the corners of their attenuation radius. Now you can always kind of try and fix this by just tweaking this attenuation radius to find like a nice area that's still forgivable before they hit that point where they overlap. 390 somehow works. So I'm going to just change these around until I get something that works. And you can also limit your cone angle by a little bit as well. By default it's 44. I might just drop it down just a tad. So with these two lights now set to static, after doing a lighting build, these things have kind of worked themselves out and everything is now calculating correctly. It's worth noting at this point that if I wanted to, I could set every light in this scene to static. It wouldn't matter too much, but because there's a chance of wanting to kind of like dial these down dynamically and whatever else, I'm going to try and keep them stationary for as long as I can, manage the scene and work from there. So now that we have the basics in, we have all of the lights themselves added, it's time for us to start looking at the finer details for lighting. And one of the big aspects of this is reflections. We'll cover this in the next video. So we've added these lights in and everything there is okay, but it's time for us to kind of start getting these subtler, smaller details going as well. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a mode called Visualize Reflections. Now this is how my world currently looks if I was to look at the reflections in my scene. You can see that if things are on my screen, it can map out a reflection based on screen space, but the rest of the world is barely touched. Now the reason I'm showing you this is that any reflective or any potentially reflective surface in the world currently doesn't know what to reflect. So it's a good idea for us to go ahead and add initially a skylight. And I'm going to set the skylight to be set to an intensity of about, I'm going to call this 0.75 on gut feeling. And it's going to look weird at first because it's going to illuminate everything, but I'm going to click build. So with the skylight built, I'm now going to click on here again and go back into reflections view. And you can see that this is now how the reflections across the scene will look. And you'll notice that while these are accurate for outside, they're not entirely accurate for the interior. That's okay. It still gives us a little bit of a shine for the fallback in the event that we haven't got reflections set up correctly. But let's get them actually set up correctly. So I'm going to go here and I'm going to type in the word reflect. And you can see that we have three options. We have planar reflections, box reflections, and sphere reflection captures. Essentially, wherever you place these in the world, so I'm going to put one here just as an example. If I drag one into the world and I go to my reflections view, you can see that any surface that is in this area is basically casting a reflection of the image from the very middle of this actor. And you can change the offset of this actor using the capture offset functionality. But basically, it takes a 360 image at this location, and then anything that this overlaps then has that image, which is a good way of faking reflections without having to dynamically capture it from literally every sequence across your map. Now, if I look at how this looks in the world, you can see that there are some kind of subtle effects that start kicking in. Things like my TV can now more accurately reflect the rest of the world. This over here is going to start getting some nicer bounce lighting kind of appearing on it. Generally, areas are going to start coming out nicer. You are going to get artifacts though. For instance, if I put this here, and this is casting a 360 reflection from that location onto everything, then it's getting red bounce lighting coming from this location. So because of that, you want to shrink these down. There's a bit of a balancing act between finding like a good number of reflection capture actors and finding like results that work well that aren't completely covering your map in reflection capture actors. I'm going to put one over here by default towards the general part of the room because it's a bit darker. I'm going to place it up because I figure that's probably going to be a slightly nicer area for it to bounce in. I'm going to switch to my reflections view as I do this, so you can see that as I drag it, it starts blending the reflections at a certain point as these two kind of cross over one another. And you can control how that fall off actually works between the two as well if you're using cube ones. But otherwise it's just a linear fall off in a standard spherical reflection capture actor. So I've put this here and I've put this here, but I'm going to set up this front area slightly differently, and that's because I really want to make sure that in a night scene, it's not so apparent in a daytime scene, but in a night scene I want to make sure that this glassway would reflect the room perfectly. So to do that, I'm going to drop in a box reflection, and I'm going to place it in the center of this little, actually no, just in front of it, there we go. I'm going to place it there, I'm going to lift it up, and I'm going to essentially place it in the middle of that window. And you can see that the box reflection capture actor is huge by default, so I'm going to scale it down a bit. And it's now, actually that's probably still too big, so I'm going to go, there we go. So that's going to capture the room reasonably nicely. Because I want to be safe about where the reflection is getting captured from, I'm going to move it a little bit in front of the door. So to do that, I change the capture offset. And when I go back to lit, I can see, might be a little tricky to see, but you can see the red reflection in the window just there. That is this couch and chair just here. They have a nice reflection now that kind of accurately represents how far they are from the door. So setting that actor in that exact location was pretty important to get a good result. Again, I can now go back to reflections, and I can see that there's still a couple of holes in my environment. This is still blue because the skylight is blue. So I'm going to get this, and I'm going to just move a couple of these into these areas, but I'm going to shrink them down as well. 250 seems like a reasonably good value. Push it towards the door. There we go. And I'm going to do it over here as well. And this now gives us reasonably good reflections across the room. So with the reflection actors now all in, we've got a skylight, we have our point lights casting general light into the scene. It's a good idea for us to start looking at some of the other things that are going on that can often be kind of easy to miss. The first of those is light map resolutions. So I'm going to be upfront about this. There's a slightly confusing element of Unreal where we refer to light map resolutions in two different ways. So when we're referring to a light map resolution of a 3D asset, a higher number is going to give you more accurate results. I'll explain that more when we're looking at objects, but essentially when we're casting light onto objects, we're baking that lighting information into them. And on a 3D object that's been added, the higher the resolution, the more light is being baked in because it's like a bigger texture that stores the lighting. Now, it's different when it comes to geometry, and that is that the lower the light map resolution refers to how much of a space there kind of is between light map texels. It's a little bit confusing, but all you need to know is that when you're doing geometry, if you're getting results that aren't quite as accurate as you would like, it's highly likely that it's because your light map resolutions are a bit too high. Now, as you increase the quality here, you will have a bit of a trade-off in that your map file size will get larger, so you need to be aware of this. But I'm going to grab these areas along the roof, and when I look at them normally, you can see that we're getting some weird shading kind of kicking in here, but this isn't absorbing it. And I'm going to set my light map resolution to 16, just as a test. I'm now going to build lighting. And you can see that now the lighting's built, we're starting to get a more accurate collection of this ambient occlusion being baked in here. Again, if I look at here and here, you can see that there's this weird line that kind of cuts between the two surfaces. And there's a couple of ways that we can fix that. It's largely because this area here is 32 and this is 32, but the others are 16, so they're blurring their light across them kind of a bit more. I'm going to try changing these to 16 and see what my result is. While I'm at it, I'm actually also going to just generally go through some of these areas and see if I can just increase the resolution just in a few of these areas to get some slightly better results. This is one of those things that, because it's ArcViz and I know we're trying to keep, it's going to look as nice as possible is really the aim here rather than efficiency and file size. I'm going to set these to 16 and kind of go from there. Usually I'd be a lot more careful. So with this built at 16, you can see that a lot of the artifacts that we were getting from these lines are now missing. That's a lot nicer, and we have a significantly better environment to work with, which is pretty good. And if I go to here, you can see that that's all come out quite nicely. And I'd say we're probably good for this first area. It's probably time for us to really start looking at doing some post-processing. So I'm going to hit save, and I'm going to save this as my final version of demo map post lighting. And in the next section, we're going to start covering the basics of post-processing within Unreal Engine 4. So it's time for us to look into post-processing. Now, post-processing is one of those things that everyone knows they have to do, but they don't quite know what they're doing. They just kind of tweak numbers until they get something, also known as game development. What I'm going to do is I'm going to load up post-process, and I'm going to drop this into the map. Now, when I drop this into the map, it drops in a cube that looks like this. Now, the thing with the post-process is it essentially gives your screen certain overrides and tells it to handle certain visuals in different ways. This means that in theory, I can set up two post-processors next to one another and actually have it so that as I move through the map, one room is shown differently to another. Now, I'll give you an example of that. If I click on one of them and I go to settings, and just as my quick example, I'm going to go scene color, and I'm going to set my scene color to be blue. That'll do. And then on this one, I'm going to set my scene color to be like that. When I'm inside of this post-process, my world looks like this. When I'm inside this post-process, my world looks like this. So these values are actually changing how the environment looks. Now, I'm going to remove one of these because for this project, I basically want things to look pretty consistent. One thing that you might want to do if you were to work on this in the future would be if you ever wanted this doorway to open and people could exit out into that area, it might be a good idea to have a post-process that's like the outside post-process and the inside post-process that you could tweak things differently. But for the time being, this is a good enough position for us to start. Now, since we're only going to have one, post-processors have a nice little feature that instead of having to like wrap around the entire level, I can just click this button that says Unbound. And you'll notice that the second I clicked Unbound, the bounds of the post-process no longer mattered at all. No matter where I am in the map right now, I'm going to see the same thing. So I'm going to uncheck scene color because that was not what I wanted for my final scene. And instead, I'm going to start looking at some of the values that we do want to tweak. Now, the first of those is under white balance, you'll see temperature. Now, if I was to increase my temperature or decrease my temperature, you can see that we get this nice subtle tint in the scene. It's a good idea to go into game mode whenever you're modifying these things. But by increasing my temperature or decreasing, I can really change the entire mood of the scene in a subtle way. By default, it's set to 6,500, but if I crank it up just a little, so 7,003, we can end up, it feels like it's a much warmer day outside, and this, everything else is just that slightly nicer temperature to kind of complete the scene. Now, so white balance really does matter, and if you want to, you can also affect the white tint, which kind of does it a little bit more aggressively. I personally usually just play with the temperature and leave it about there. Color grading is something that we're not going to tinker with too much. Suffice to say, if I wanted to, I could really affect how the world is calculated by desaturating certain channels. Increasing contrast on certain channels is another strong thing, so I could end up with a scene that, look, it looks quite cool, but as far as ArcViz goes, it's not particularly great. That said, if you're ever after a scene where you're having a bit of a flashback memory kicking in, color grading settings here for saturation, contrast, and especially gamma and gain to kind of get that old filmic view for a memory works really, really well. It also means that things like your whites can blow out in a way nicer way to kind of suit a memory. That said, because that's not what we're doing, I'm going to uncheck these and I'm going to go into the next sections that matter. Now, the color grading for shadows, midtones, and highlights, I just use to control them in certain areas. So for instance, if I wanted to only desaturate the shadows of the scene, I could do so. So you can see here that that's only affecting the darker areas of the couch while everything else is staying unaffected. So that's how those work, and that's per channel. So I could do that with any of them and I would get a similar effect. I don't really want to tinker with that for this, but I'd like you to know exactly what you're looking at. Now, as far as film is concerned, film is pretty useful. It's used to simulate how a camera actually takes in footage, which means you can do a lot of stuff like crushing your shadows and your highlights and generally kind of mixing your channels a little bit. For this kind of stuff, it's way too in detail for me to really want to cover in this tutorial. So instead, we're going to look at some of the things that we do care about. You've already seen scene color, but the first one we're going to look at is bloom. Now, bloom is very, very useful. However, it's one of those things that people can kind of treat in a slightly obnoxious way. If I was to crank up bloom, you'd get this. How it works is anytime something on the screen is above the threshold lighting value, it's going to start to blur it out and create a nice highlight. So if I set bloom to 0, the scene looks like this. I'm just going to stare at this light as my example. If I set bloom to 0, it looks like this. If I crank it to 5, it's now making it super bright and pushing out. And if I look around the world, I can see that same thing. And keep in mind, it's not just from the lighting. It's also in situations like this where it's kind of bouncing out. So the indirect lighting is causing these to bloom out in certain ways. So it can be very, very... It's very, very tempting to use a lot of bloom, but the truth is that too much bloom really quickly looks like amateur hour, so avoid doing it. One thing that I find is balancing the threshold is a good idea, so I can put the bloom up, but by increasing the threshold, the only things that actually do bloom are those things that are at a very high brightness level. So see this here? If I was to decrease the threshold, and then slowly increase it, until eventually only some things would actually be blooming. Now, obviously, that was a bit too hard on this, but it's a good example of where you would go. So I'm going to set this threshold by default to about, I think 2 looks good. So you get a bit of bloom kicking in. If I crank this up, you can see it. If I get a bit of bloom kicking in certain areas, but for the most part, my threshold's okay, so that we're not getting it excessively in other areas. I might decrease the threshold just a little bit so this window kind of picks up a nice glow coming from it. But we're still ruling out some of the objects, the other objects that were previously blooming out. So with that done, we're now going to work through some other areas. Things like your size scale control how large the bloom is. So if I do this, I'm just going to set them back to default for a second. If I was to do this and then increase the size scale, you're going to see that it increases the overall blur of the bloom. So if I decrease my size scale, it kind of just confines it to the area pretty close to where it actually is blooming from. But as I increase it, that blur reaches wider and wider and wider and wider. Now, by default, it's at 4. I actually personally kind of prefer it to be at a slightly lower value of around 1 or 2. To each their own, though. So I'm going to set my intensity to 1.5. I'm going to set my threshold to 2. I'm going to keep my size scale a little bit more. Oh, wait, threshold 1.5. I'm going to keep my size scale around there. Again, though, if you did want to crank this up, it really kind of depends on the effect that you're after. 3 in this instance, or 4 or 5, is going to give way more of a look of this light kind of billowing out into the room, whereas 1 or 2 is going to kind of keep it more as specifically that source. It's up to you. Now that I'm looking at it, I might actually keep it as 4 for this. So the next part of bloom that we need to really consider is the size and tint. So for this, I've turned up the intensity. It was at 2 before, but I'm just going to crank it up to 15. And I'm going to just show you how some of the sizing works. Essentially, bloom works by doing a bunch of blur passes, one after the other, on top of it. So you can control the size of each blur. So if I pull back to here, and I change the size of the first blur pass, so you can see that the inner rim is switching between being visible and not. So you can really kind of tightly control what you're doing here. If I am going to adjust this, it's usually because I'm turning it down a little bit around that inner rim so you can still see the outline of the shape. When it's at its default, you can see that it's a lot harder to identify it, and instead it's just kind of this blur. So I'm going to turn that down to like 0.5. This works for all the rest of them as well, so again, I can kind of resize these bloom blurs to be the exact size that I want. It's a good idea to actually just use the sliders when you're dealing with this. So I'm just clicking on the number and just kind of dragging until I get the exact kind of bloom that I want. 5. I kind of want this to spread out towards the end, so this is probably going to be, about that. And I'm then going to turn down my intensity until I get back to an area that's a bit friendlier. Now, the other thing that I could do is tinting. So each of these passes can actually be a different color. So what I mean by that is I'm going to turn this up again so you can see what's going on. And I'm going to change my blur to tint from being gray to now being a slight red. You can see as I crank that number up, you can actually see the blur pass itself. But it's a good idea to work out how you want to tint each pass. I typically, when I'm approaching this kind of stuff, would go kind of like a subtle curve in my tints, one after the other. So the first one is going to be gray, but then the next one's going to be blue, and then the next one's going to be a slightly darker blue. Actually, I might just lighten up that first one. So it's kind of like more of an intermediate step between the gray and the blue. And then I'm going to go up to a nice, brighter, almost borderline yellow. And then I'm going to pull that down again to a blue. And it's very, very subtle when you do this, but it does actually change how the room feels. So with those in, you can see that we have now slightly a slightly more blue kind of bloom kind of coming out of it. If I was to turn them back to default values, you can see the difference is actually reasonably substantial on some of the areas. Again, if I turn off my blur size, we kind of jump back to this. And if I turn them up, we end up with this. Now, the next thing that I can do here that might be nice is going about the dirt mask intensity. So to use a dirt mask, I've already gone and made one, but essentially what this texture is, I'll load it up so you can see it, is a texture that looks like this. Okay, so they've simulated what would happen, what the screen would look like if there was just some grunge on the lens and just baked it into a texture. Now, once this is done, I can actually turn up my dirt mask intensity. I'm going to set it to 50 as an example so you can see it. You can see it popping in around here. As I'm now looking towards the bloom, we get a slightly more realistic, I guess is the word that I meant to be using here, lens effect kind of going on. Now, this really depends on the kind of overall effect that you're after, and it's a really love or hate kind of a deal. Some people really, really like it, and some people just despise it. I'm personally for it in certain situations. I think it looks really good, especially in areas like where you're simulating like something like Blade Runner or doing that kind of futuristic look. A little bit of grunge on the lens goes a long way. Just finding the right way to use it though is the trickiest bit. Just kind of getting the right amount. One of the issues with getting the grunge looking good as well is that, I mean, when I do it here, the max the slider lets me go is 8, which is a super subtle grunge. And I actually, if I'm going to use it, I'll usually go the whole hog and set it to like 20 or so, 25, at which point it's a bit more visible if we're looking for it, but I think it can look nice in certain situations. So I'm going to leave that enabled for the time being. The other thing that's worth noting is that you can tint it a bit. Now the reason tinting it might be good for you, obviously not in an ArcViz demo, but making it look like there's some green grunge on the screen if you're in the sewers or something might be a bit more appropriate as to, to whatever it is you're trying to do. So I'm going to set this up to be a pretty much a gray tint. I'm also going to turn my bloom down to where it was before, which was a level of about 1 or 2. That's alright for that. Now that we've covered bloom, we're going to move into some more post-processing effects in the next lesson. In the last section, we covered the beginnings of post-processing, but it's quite a big area to look at, so we'll continue with that now. First up, we have auto exposure. So auto exposure is it's very useful, but it's also something you've really got to watch out for, because if you forget that you have auto exposure enabled, it can really ruin a scene. So the more I see this, the more I actually want to turn that dirt mask intensity down a bit to be a little more subtle. Yep, there we go. So when it comes to auto exposure, basically you've got a low percent and a high percent, which control how much of the screen has to be in darkness or lit for this to take effect. And essentially what it does is it automatically sets the brightness levels between one of 2 different levels. So if I control my minimum brightness level, I can now push it to here. And as I pull this back, the auto exposure is kicking in and fading down to a level that's equal to default lighting. Whereas my max brightness level is going to push it further up. So if I was to tweak my max brightness level, and lower the percent that it took to reach to hit max brightness levels, we would unfortunately end up getting this. I typically don't touch these unless I really want to. The main thing that I do work with is going to be my speed up and my speed down, which controls how quickly it goes from being accustomed to like a dark environment to being a bright environment. So these variables can be pretty useful. In this situation though, I would, oops, not too far. So finding a nice point in the screen. Open one, because it's kind of fading between them. There we go. So now I can clearly see it because it does very quickly. So finding a nice value for these. If it's dark, we want to set this to be the lowest percent with which you do it is going to be, say, 7%, and my minimum brightness is going to be, oops, 0.875. Oh, that looks alright. And max brightness, I mean, I could touch, but we're not really changing brightness too much. Auto exposure is one of those things that we're going to look more when we do an evening version of this map. So I'm going to leave those values where they are for the time being. And I'm going to reset the time it takes though, so that it's a bit more natural for your eyes to adjust. Lens flares, again on the list of things that are kind of contentious. If I do lens flares and we kind of get some going on. So to get lens flares working, I'm just going to click here and set an intensity value. I'm going to go with 5 for the minute. And I'm also going to select a bokeh shape. So I'm just going to click here and I'm going to type in the word bokeh. Now these are 3 textures that we have stored inside of the ArcViz folder. And now as I move my screen across, you can start to see the lens flares kind of kicking in there. And you can control how big these are and what kind of threshold it takes to get this. So if I wanted to increase the size, we can kind of get this more blurred out version kicking in. Whereas if I do this, we can kind of get these tinier. I mean, if I was going to do this, I'd probably go here and I'd change the threshold to be just very subtle. And I'd turn my intensity right down. Now they kind of pop in. Now, if you want to as well, you can control the color of each one as they go through. These are the default tints, and they work reasonably well. But again, it's kind of a situational setup, so if you do want to tweak them, go for it. Now, the next is what I would argue is one of the most important areas of what we've been doing. I'm going to go ambient occlusion, and I'm going to show you how this works. The edges of two surfaces, and anytime they touch, it goes ahead and adds this darkness into them. So if I look here at this corner and I set ambient off, whereas as I crank it up, now it doesn't just do it on these corners here, it's also going to do it on the statue. So for instance, if I look here, 0, 1, you can see it's getting darker inside here and in around these curves and stuff. Now, turning the ambient occlusion up is a thing that people are immediately going to want to do, but finding the right balance for it is also really important to get your scene looking good. So in this situation, what I'm going to do is I'm going to first off set the radius to be in world space. If I go radius in world space and check it, the ambient occlusion extends up to 2 meters away in world space. So see, as I increase that, I'm controlling how far the ambient occlusion is willing to spread between surfaces. So I personally find kind of doing a tighter, more controlled AO at a lower intensity works reasonably nicely. That said, there are plenty of different ways to achieve this. So you could go through here and like up the power, which is going to result in this. So you can see it's at the inside of it, it's getting far stronger. That said, I personally prefer to kind of just work off the world radius, get it nice that way, and tweak the rest of it from there. So now that we've kind of got that looking all right for the initial pass, I might actually tweak that a little bit further. So quality, again, because we're ArcViz, let's just turn that up to 100, so that way we get a nice smoother transition. Before it was at 50, it's hard to see here, so I'm just going to turn the intensity up so you can really see it. 0 quality, 50 quality, 100 quality. So that's why I'm kind of pushing for a value that's around there. At the moment my radius is quite high, so I'm gonna drop to about 50. That way it's just kind of the edges of the room that are really getting highlighted, which I think looks alright. As I mentioned before, you can use the power to kind of control how strong this is. I'm gonna, instead of going for a 2, I'm gonna push it up just a fraction so it's slightly darker inside of those areas. The other one that we can work with is bias. The bias is going to control where, like how it kind of creeps in and out of the corner. So as I increase it, you can see that the bias is kind of pulling back into the corner itself. So for this type of scene, I would typically use a bias of about 5. You can see this wall's now looking a lot nicer than what we had before. The MIP blend is basically, it controls how it actually blends into your light maps. So MIP blend, at the moment I've got it set to 0.6. If we wanted to crank it up a bit, we could, but I wouldn't go too far above where we are. I'm going to leave the rest of it all there, so that should be fine. Yeah, that looks nicer. Now we are getting a little bit of a weird effect around this post, which could be the result of a couple of different areas. Yeah, okay. So the reason for that kicking in so strongly was it's kind of at a perfect in-between area where at exactly 50 units away, it's not really calculating it very well. I could push the thing up to about 60 instead of 50, and it looks a little bit better. Yeah, it's nicer. Now, the next is global illumination. So global illumination is very, very, very useful. This is one of those areas that a lot of the time people are doing their lighting and they're like, oh, why doesn't it look good? And I'm like, well, you haven't set up your GI contribution correctly. And they're like, I don't know what those words mean. So here's where we cover that. If I go to global illumination and I go indirect lighting intensity, this If I turn it off, this will immediately give you an idea of what's happening. Basically, this controls the level of your bounce lighting in the scene. So all of your lights are directly casting light into the world, and then they're bouncing. And this is what we use to scale how much of an effect that bounce lighting has on the rest of the scene. By default, it's 1. But I almost kind of want to push it up a little bit to about 1.25. It's just a little bit nicer. By the way, I'm really regretting having dirt on the screen for this because we're trying to go for something that was super clean. So as we go, I'm just going to keep turning this dirt mask down and down. That's okay. Okay, AO, global illumination. Okay, and the other thing we can do with the global illumination is we can tweak the color, which is really good. It's very similar to the temperature, except this is only changing the temperature of the tint of the bounce lighting itself. So if we want the prime lighting to always look the same, but we want that bounce lighting to have that slightly more, sunnier feel in this area, for instance, we can kind of get this. And you could achieve something similar by doing only the midtones and shadows of the other area, but this is, I personally think it works a little bit nicer for some scenes. So getting that kind of like slightly orangey look. Typically what I do is I get what I think looks good now, and then I dial it back because I know that in about 10 minutes time, I'm going to want to dial it back. So I'm going to get something that's just slightly yellower. So we get a slightly friendlier bounce light that kind of works with the temperature that we set up before. Yeah, that looks alright. Depth of field is one of those areas that, we can cover, but it's more of a cinema technique. If you're using depth of field and you're unfamiliar with it, essentially what you're doing is you're adding blur to areas that are beyond or before a certain region. If I was to turn this on, I could just set my scale to 1. Now at the moment this is what I'm seeing because my depth of field is set to render stuff that's really far away. But if I wanted to get my focal distance and tell it to focus on things that are at a specific point in the map, say something that is 2 meters in front of me, and then I set my scale to like 0. We now end up with like that blurring of anything that is beyond or before that region. Now, for something like this, it's not really the best use of depth of field. It is good when you're trying to mimic a real-world camera, or if you're doing a cinematic scene. So if I turn it on and off, you can kind of see it kicking in around the edges there. If you are doing a real-world scene or a cinematic scene, and you want to follow a specific actor, you can use that focal point as something that you're, following the entire time. It's something that I don't use too often in games, though, unless I really, really need to. Now, after depth of field, motion blur. This kind of goes without saying. It just adds blur to anything that's moving around. It's not something we would touch in an ArcViz demo, so I don't really have an easy way to demonstrate it. MISC is screen percentage. So this is one of those areas that it helps a lot in VR. You're not going to see a difference when you're in the editor, but when you are working with VR projects, you can basically super sample them by cranking up your screen percentage to like 150, at which point you'll get a far, far better image in VR. It is kind of useless for us to use right now, though, so I'm just not going to touch it. Screen space reflections are the reflections that we were seeing earlier. So if I do show reflections only, you can see that there are some reflections that are perfectly being calculated based on what I can see. And as those objects exit my screen, you can see that it's no longer calculating the reflection. So as I can see the block, it's essentially just working on a transform on the screen to kind of get that effect. And most of the time it looks really good, and your reflection actors kind of pick up the rest of it and nicely fade between them. In a demo like this, it's a good idea to push the quality up. So before it was at 50, but if I push it up to 100, we're just going to end up with slightly nicer reflections. The other thing you can set up is at what roughness level do screen reflections actually kick in. So for this kind of a thing, if I was to turn this up, I'm actually going to have to show you in a lit mode. So at the moment, if I look at this surface, and then I decrease the required point for screen reflections, you can kind of see it kicking in. So once this roughness goes beneath a level, yeah, about 0.7 looks good. Again, this is one of those things that's going to be really per map. So you're going to need to tweak it as you see fit. Now the next thing I'm going to do, so blendables are if you want to add materials that are going over the top. If I wanted to add a cartoon shader or an edge detection shader, I would do it through the blendables. Other than that though, we've kind of covered the brunt of it. I'm going to kind of look at my scene as a whole and retweak a bunch of things that we've tinkered with. The first and foremost I'm going to tinker with is going to be bloom. I'm going to up the threshold with which things start to bloom out. And I'm going to set my bloom amount to be a far friendlier level. I'm actually going to turn it all the way down to like, there we go. I don't mind the lens effect kicking in, but I do mind the bloom being as nasty as it was. We're going to turn down my size scale for all of this actually. There we go, now made up with that. The lens effects as well, I'm going to just go back through and just turn these things down. As I said, typically the first time you do something, you do way too much of it, and then you go back and just adjust.